everybody. Wonderful to see so many of our students here, especially since it's a little bit of a busy time of year right now. So it's a testament to our speaker, that our guest, that you're all here. So Ambassador Katherine Tai served as the 19th U.S. Trade Representative, which made her a member of President Biden's cabinet. And in that role, she served as the principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on U.S. trade policy from March 2021 to January 2025. She's going to share with you, I won't go through all the accolades. She's going to share with you about her philosophy on trade. I will just say, as a personal aside, I served in the White House in the Obama administration when the president was negotiating TPA and TPP, and never would I have imagined, having gone through that experience, serving a president who I have utmost respect and affection for, that we could have a U.S. trade representative like Ambassador Tai. So really excited for you to share with the students, especially our students. I see many of our students who I know have particular interest in the labor movement, how you approached U.S. trade policy. So we're going to let you talk with the students a little bit, and then you and I will talk, and then you will definitely have time to talk all together.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon, and it's really delightful to be with all of you. I'm just walking into the building in this classroom, and I'm realizing I'm pretty sure I had a class in here, and I'm racking my brains around which class it was. It was only 25 plus years ago, so, it's really great to be back at HLS and to meet all of you, the next generation of lawyers and legal minds and people in the world to shape this world, which has come a long way, but also has a long way to go. Let me talk a little bit about trade policy and my experience in the Biden administration. I'll give you like one particular kind of cross-section presentation, like one nutshell worth of what it was like to be trade representative in the Biden administration. And then I'd really like to open it up. I particularly want to express my appreciation for being hosted here by Professor Block and the CLJE. I think this program is extraordinary, and I'm so glad to be able to collaborate with all of you through this engagement. When I came in as trade representative, we, the United States, had already been through the first Trump administration. And like the second Trump administration, it really led with trade and tariffs, and the renegotiation of the NAFTA, and taking on the China trade challenge. That caused a lot of consternation. It broke a lot with orthodoxy and tradition. But in the midst of the breakage, it also created a lot of opportunity. One of the things that we were really thoughtful about, this is my time prior to being in the Biden administration, it was working for the House Ways and Means Democrats, and more broadly, the House Democratic Caucus on trade issues. The Trump years were extremely challenging. And primarily, I would say that it challenged us as Democrats to really re-examine where we stood on the issue of trade and where our workers factored into it. Democrats have always enjoyed the support of workers and the unions. Traditionally, I would say always traditionally enjoyed that support. And I think that things started to change in the 1990s. One of the really stunning aspects of the first Trump term was the degree to which President Trump advanced these very different and unorthodox trade policies in the name of American workers who had felt very harmed by, US trade policies and then ignored by the policy establishment. And it really, I think, opened up a conversation and an activity where Democrats had to examine what their values are with respect to trade. That exercise actually got us through the Trump administration and the renegotiation of the NAFTA and allowed us to double down on our values, that trade has to include rules for workers, protections for workers, that trade rules have to reflect the plight of workers as economic producers in the world. We double down on our conviction that the impact of trade on the environment, on our natural resources, and on our climate are important and relevant to the way trade policies are conducted. We double down on our commitment to democratic principles of accountability, of principles of fair and affordable access to things like life-saving medicines. And those values got us through a renegotiation of the NAFTA and the renegotiation of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement through ratification of that agreement. I do want to make a point, though, that the support that the renegotiated NAFTA and the renegotiated USMCA saw in the House of Representatives and the Senate also reflected the basic proposition that NAFTA had already been in place for 25 years. And this renegotiation was to try to remediate certain inequities that were baked into the pie at the very beginning. I've often been asked, why don't you just do all of the plus-ups that you had in the USMCA renegotiation, and why didn't you as the Biden administration just go out and add those into a bunch of new free trade agreements? I think that that's fundamentally something to keep your mind trained on, which is that fundamental proposition of liberalizing trade, completely opening up our economy, and joining it with another economy continues to have the same kinds of negative and harmful impacts as the types of free trade agreements we've done in the past. When people ask me about what the trade policy that the Biden administration advanced was about, our tagline, if you will, our slogan, our home base was also, we wanted to advance trade policy that was centered on workers. And that was sort of taking a couple decades of trade practice and flipping it on its head, where workers might have been, by democratic administrations, really invited to the table, but where workers and worker organizations consistently felt like their concerns weren't brought into reflecting the trade policies, that they were made to feel that they had been listened to but not heard, or heard but not listened to, if that makes sense. They weren't seeing their perspectives reflected in the trade policies. The trade policies, if you graph them out, continue to kind of follow the same trajectory. So what we wanted to do was to make very, very clear to our workers, to the rest of the economy, to our counterparts, that we were going to put workers at the center of our trade policy to start to remediate a trajectory of trade that had really pushed workers to the side and has really wrought a lot of the economic, social, and political consequences that we continue to live through every single day, even today. When I'm asked about what an example is of worker-centered trade, how is this more than just a slogan, I will always come back to this very interesting mechanism that we had incorporated into the USMCA on the renegotiation between the Trump administration and the congressional Democrats, which was plussed up rules in the worker chapter, in the labor chapter, but then also an entirely new mechanism to drive accountability, not just by our partner country, Mexico, which actually has very good labor laws on paper, and where we have, just plussed up the rules inside of the agreement. We were also looking for a mechanism to create accountability by corporate actors, some of the greatest beneficiaries of trade policies over the last decades, and beneficiaries who had up until the USMCA not really ever had the lens of scrutiny placed directly on them. So this USMCA labor enforcement mechanism, we call it the Rapid Response Mechanism for short, or the RRM, allows for the United States and Canada to raise with the government of Mexico a concern that freedom of association, collective bargaining rights are not being respected at a particular facility. We no longer needed to build a case to say, look, there's this recurring pattern, there's a systemic problem, and to try to marshal all the evidence. Instead, we had a mechanism that would reach through the agreement to specific facilities that were denying rights that were guaranteed by Mexican law and that were required by the USMCA. And the mechanism then opens up a process for essentially validating or verifying whether or not these basic rights of workers were in fact being denied. And if they are denied, how to remediate it. And if the Mexican government decides that there is no denial, but the United States, based on the evidence that is accessible to us, decides that no, we're convinced that there is a denial, it creates a process for addressing that disagreement and getting to the bottom of the facts. And if there ultimately is found to be a denial, then that opens up the process for remediation. The remediation process then is also novel. If there is a company or a corporate family that is found 3 times to have violated the requirements under Mexican law and the same requirements under the USMCA, what will happen is that that corporate entity will stop being able to export goods into the United States. So there is a giant hammer that's attached to this entire process. Along the way also, while you're investigating and determining the facts around each individual case, what happens at the border is the process of liquidation of customs formalities, which is when customs say all the formalities are done, your stuff is free to go. We close the books on this particular importation activity. We suspend that liquidation to keep open the possibility that if we find that there is wrongdoing, that we would come back and assess penalties. That has proved to be powerful in terms of incentives for getting the attention of companies and then incentivizing them to remediate problems when they are found. Over the course of my time as USTR, we invoked this mechanism 30 times. We concluded cases 24 times. When you look at the aggregate of what we were able to do in those 24 cases, we won for Mexico's workers new votes on union representation, new independent union representation, new collective bargaining agreements that the workers had actually seen before they went into effect and approved, back pay, increased wages, sometimes for the first time ever in those workers' experiences at that facility. We got wrongfully terminated workers reinstated. We got the workers better benefits, all to the tune of a couple million US dollars worth of benefits. There were at least 6 cases that we started that we didn't have the time to see through to the end. You will not read this in the papers because our media hardly ever reports on this mechanism. But my successor in the second Trump administration has carried through every single one of those cases and then brought new cases of his own. So something interesting that you will not hear reported on, but is actually really important to track as a matter of the evolution of trade policy, is that in the first Trump administration, the administration of President Donald J. Trump and congressional Democrats led by Speaker Pelosi, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Richard Neal, worked together to create this novel mechanism in a trade agreement that for the first time allows workers to empower themselves. This mechanism exists only inside of a trade agreement. We have, for the first time in our history, flipped the script on what trade means for workers. For the first time, we've actually shown, we've proven what the unions have been trying to tell us this entire time, that trade doesn't have to be hostile to the interests of workers. That trade done right can actually empower workers, not just in Mexico and not just in America, but just imagine trade could be the vehicle through which workers can be empowered throughout the world. That, I think, is something that I want to keep coming back to, and this is a tremendous opportunity to share with this audience what is happening under the radar, this flipping of the script, and what it can mean for the way that we do trade going forward. Thank you so much.
Just such an amazing story, and I really, I can't overemphasize what a complete shift this was. Again, having been in the White House with TPA and TPP, the president couldn't even talk to the labor movement because there was such a difference of opinion about how to conduct trade policy. And I've seen, from my part of the White House, knowing what was going on with what you were doing is really just remarkable. So my labor lawyer brain goes to, who's going to do this to us? Because we have trading partners throughout much of the EU who have labor laws that are in relation to us the same way we thought about our labor laws in relation to Mexico. Is that just a crazy thing to say? Could you ever imagine, are there any European countries that we trade with in a way that it would be in their interests to have a similar, like the rapid response mechanism, like the kind of push for labor law reform imposed on us as part of our trade, or are we just too big a player for anybody to treat us the way we treated Mexico?
So those are all excellent questions. There are a couple subparts to that question. So one, if we look at the rapid response mechanism in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, both the United States and Canada have access to this provision. But Mexico is unique in responding to it. There is not a reciprocity in the application of this mechanism. And that reflects some of the relative standards. I think that, to be fair, if you look at the exercise of labor rights and worker power in the United States and Canada, we have generally a more healthy industrial labor environment. There are more independent unions here in the United States and Canada than there are in Mexico. So there's a little bit of that, but definitely political power comes into that also, and politics. And I'll say the reason why the RRM is a one-way street is because I do not think that US politics were ready in 2019 and 2020 to have that mechanism turn back on us. It's not because we're perfect, right? There's definitely political dynamics there. The conversation with the Europeans is a really interesting one, because if you talk to American unions and worker representatives, they will say, this is another way of coming at it, there are these European companies, manufacturers, who have invested in production here in the United States. They have to abide by very high standards for worker protections and in their relationship with their labor unions back at home, as required under European law and as part of European tradition. But when they come here to the United States, they behave completely differently. Right? There's another angle to that where when I was on the Hill, it started on the Hill, big European companies that have set up shop here would come in to lobby individual member offices and say, we're really trying to invest in America, but you don't have the labor force to fulfill the kinds of engineering jobs that and manufacturing, high-skilled manufacturing jobs that we're offering, right? So we'd like to do more, but it's your fault that you just don't have the workforce. They're not trained up, they don't have access to the education, and lots of times we can't rely on them to show up And one of the fact patterns that started to emerge was we started to ask them, where are your facilities? Your facilities, you've chosen to put your facilities in the states and in the communities where there are the least protections for workers, where there's the least access to education and training for those workers, and beyond for their communities. You have chosen to make cost reduction your primary driving force for your production, and this is what you get, right? TTIP, which was also one of the big late Obama year legacy pushes in trade, TTIP started to crumble under the weight of politics, actually first in Europe, before it actually started to crumble here in the US. And I think in Europe there were a lot of reasons for it, but this dynamic about European producers and European workers being concerned that good European jobs were going to be outsourced to the wild west of, low labor standard enforcement, low labor investment in the United States was definitely at work. I will tell you though, the interesting thing is that those concerns, there is a gap in my experience between those concerns and those who are concerned about that and the European trade negotiators. And no European trade negotiator that I dealt with directly was tracking what was happening in the USMCA. When we started to bring some of the rapid response mechanism pieces into the critical minerals agreement negotiation, there was kind of like shock on the other side, and not in an odd kind of way, but as in a, we are not comfortable with this, and we haven't been tracking it at all. So yes, I think by logic, and if you are steeped in the labor and worker part of the conversation, you absolutely would expect that might have come up as a pressure point or as an ask or demand by the European side. I am here to tell you it never came up.
Which speaks to it not being on the agenda of the European trade unions, right?
Well, or that there's enough of a gap between the trade unions and the European trade negotiators.
It's just fascinating, thank you. It's like an idea that has been lodged in my brain since TTIP was still a thing.
Yeah.
So I want to get to student questions, but I do want to ask you about, an issue that's was in the news a lot at the end of the Biden administration, the beginning of the second Trump administration, which was the sale of US Steel. And I understand, I think this is public, because I found it on the internet, that you were a vocal dissenting voice in CFIUS in the review of the US Steel sale to Nippon Steel. And then President Biden, in fact, eventually said that he was opposed to the deal. During the campaign, President Trump also said that he was opposed to the deal and then changed his mind, and we have now the sale has been executed with this golden share. So one is just a question of have you heard about how US workers are faring? The deal is still relatively new. And just your thoughts about whether golden shares that mechanism in the right hands could be an effective tool in protecting workers.
Yeah. So really interesting, right? You read it because you read it in the public news reporting that I was a vocal dissenter. I never made my views publicly known during the consideration under CFIUS of the U.S. Steel acquisition. So I don't know who thought I was vocal and why it got reported. If you think about why it's reported, it's not because I said anything to the press. And in fact, I didn't say that much. I was pretty careful about what I said inside of the administration. That is very much the painting of Katherine Tai that is done by my colleagues inside the administration, and I would say my foreign policy colleagues, who felt like it was a violation of foreign policy norms to have this conversation about the possibility that there may be a security risk, an economic security risk, national security risk in the acquisition by Nippon Steel of US Steel. So that's just one thing I wanted to share with all of you, which is it's interesting to say, to hear that read back to me. A friend of mine who is actually a reporter who might have authored some of these articles and whose sources I feel like I have a generally good sense for, was in Japan and told me, my mother-in-law is in Japan here, and you were on the news. And I told her I knew you, and she was very impressed by that. And I said, I'm actually really, I can guess why I was on the news in Japan at the end of the Biden administration. I'm not going to ask what was being said about me. And, since you reported on some of this, I think that your mother-in-law should be not just impressed that you know me, but she should know the role that you played in making me part of the conversation in Japan around this time. To get to the substance, which is that Nippon Steel has now acquired US Steel, and that there were some unique and new conditions that were imposed by the Trump administration around that, I think it's worth studying. I think it's worth asking. I mean, I'm always someone who, I'm sure you saw this in the White House. When you are in these levels of government, administrations, and in governance, you are quite often faced with these kind of impossible choices, right? It's like the Sophie's choice, right? Where you're asked, like, which of your children do you want to save and which one are you going to sacrifice, right? Or, you have only two options, yes or no, right? And like neither of the options is great. I feel like the real trick, the challenge and strategy in being in these positions is to push beyond that yes, no, black and white choice that you're given, and to find a way to create a dimension that allows you to get out of the trap. And you know what? I mean, I'm not deep on the conditions of the US Steel acquisition, but this shared concept, I think, does go some way to breaking out of that you have only two options, yes or no, right? This is the injection of another element of dimension into making that decision, and without getting into whether or not that was the right structure, I think, your question isn't asking me that. Your question is this an interesting element that's being introduced? I think it is an interesting element that's being introduced.
And maybe in the right hands,
And with
could
the right
actually be
architecture,
yeah,
so
a force for building worker power. All right, my last question. I'm really interested in how complex supply chains have become. And the ability for like multinational corporations to sort of undermine labor standards through these complex supply chains and maybe evade some of the kinds of protections that you work to put in place. What are strategies, you thought about what are strategies to deal with that? Because it seems like this is only, it's a globalized economy now. It's only going to get more complex.
Yes. A couple tools that we had. One of them was the forced labor import ban, Section 307 of the Trade Act of 1930, 1933. It's a very, very old provision that we had that really was never enforced because of a loophole out of it. We closed the loophole in 2015, and we start replicating it in our trade agreements. In fact, interestingly, the Trump administration in the second term is still replicating a similar commitment in some of their agreements with these trading partners over the tariffs, right? Seeking commitments from those trading partners to also implement a forced labor import ban. When we were working with our forced labor import ban, there's a really important question, which is, how do you know if, right? It's very strong on the text. Imports of goods made in whole or in part using forced labor are prohibited from entering the United States. So that's very clear. What is not so clear is, how do you know if the thing that's arriving in a container inside of boxes, how do you know how it was produced, who it was produced by, and under what circumstances, right? So that had created a whole bunch of questions about the burden of proof. Who has to prove that it's not been produced using forced labor, or that it has been produced using forced labor? And then how do you know? And we had very difficult conversations with our importers around whose responsibility it was to know. And I think that there are a lot of these multinationals, right, who would say, I'm the multinational, and I have layers of contractors and subcontractors. I can't possibly know what they're doing at that level. And, I would say these multinationals are very savvy, they're very powerful and resourceful, they're like really smart people who work for them. I think it is possible for them to know. It's gonna require more cost to be able to track and to trace, and it's not something that they've done. The European due diligence laws that I think are being rolled back right now, but there's another way of coming at this, which is due diligence laws, right? You just get at putting the onus on the businesses to know and to be able to prove when asked. I think this calls into relief a more fundamental question about what you need to do, and I think it's the changing of attitudes, right? In a world economic order where we have been rewarding behaviors and decisions that minimize costs and try to push prices down as far as possible, right? To the point where I think that they are artificially low priced and cheap. There's so many externalities that have been excluded from the price. There's this really difficult discussion that's going on right now, which a lot of it is centered on the tariffs, right? But can be expanded out to any change in policy or introduction of a practice that could increase the prices of things should be prohibited because people need affordable access to things. I'm not arguing with the fact that people need to have affordable access to things, right? But I think that affordable implies a kind of a bargain and a deal. Affordable doesn't mean as cheap as possible and then impossibly cheap, right? Affordable, I think, implies that it's not built on the exploitation of the planet or other human beings, and that it's built on a system that's not pitting countries against each other to undermine each other, to underbid each other. And it's not built on a system that could break at any given point in time. And I think that that's a really important theme to come back to, because I was recently in a debate hosted by the business school where this affordability argument was really put forward to combat the idea that free trade and the way we practiced it should be rethought, or that tariffs could ever be useful. And the argument was tariffs will always make things more expensive. People need things to be as cheap as possible. Ergo, tariffs bad, free trade will always be good. And I was thinking about that, and I didn't get a chance to come back to that question. But, to bring us back to workers, which is if that's your logic, and if that's the logic of the entire system that you've built, well, then bring back slavery. Because you know what's going to cost, what's going to contribute to cost is the wages that you pay to people to produce the things, right? It's an impossible argument, and it's absurd. And I think that reinforces that the grand bargain of trade policies and the bargain that needs to happen between capital and labor and natural resources, right? And all of the factors of production and all of the elements of economic vitality and activity all have to find their place in how we're going to rebuild how we do trade with each other and with the entire world.
That's such a powerful way of putting it. I see some of my students here, and I teach a reading group on low-wage work. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we talk about is this affordability, and there are retailers who have built their whole business model around selling products that poor people can afford. The problem is that then there are poor people who work for them who are subsidized by the federal government through SNAP and through other public forms of income support, which then the corporation needs the benefit of. So it's such a powerful model that you've given us. All right, I can talk to you all day, but we have a lot of interested people here, all the way in the back.
Thank you for chatting with us today. I'm curious to know your thoughts on sort of the level of discourse that we saw about tariffs for the first 9 months of this administration.
Yeah.
I think certainly in American history we've had public debate about trade deals or tariffs, but for this time around it seemed like everyone was talking about it. It was on every news channel. Do you think the news organization did their duty? Like, what do you think of the maturity of the conversation?
Yeah, I think it's really immature, and that's my short answer. I'll tell you a little bit of a story though, right? So the tariffs started being applied like very quickly, and no one should have been surprised because we've all lived through the first Trump administration. President Trump was very clear on the campaign trail that he's still the tariff man. And I think that the news organizations are chasing like the word I want to use here, like the tariff mania, right? And oftentimes they're missing the bigger picture. The first week of April, right? April 2nd was Liberation Day, right? Okay. I was more popular in the news media that week than I had been the entire 4 years when I was actually the U.S. Trade Representative. Okay? News outlets would call me up and be like, hey, will you come on? And I'd be like, who are you again? You have literally never called me before, right? So that's like the power of the Trump administration and Donald Trump himself to seize the attention of the media, of America, of the world, with his trade policies and his tariff policies. I went out there to try to have a conversation about tariffs. What is a tariff? It's just a policy measure, a policy tool. The conversation I think we should be having is, why are they saying they're using the tariffs? How are they constructing the tariff program? Do these two things match up? Do we agree that the objectives are laudable or desirable? What do we think of the design? Does the design undermine the objective that's stated? And then, as the tariffs are implemented and the tariff programs and negotiations advance, are we actually achieving any of the goals that have been stated out front? I think that that's actually what we need to be talking about, and then how it fits into a larger picture of what the Trump administration is doing with respect to economics, with respect to foreign policy, etc. But I think that we've just got caught in this loop of tariffs. Trump loves tariffs. Tariffs must be bad. Let's marshal all of the arguments for why tariffs are bad. And it's like you just keep focusing on the bright, shiny object, and you're missing everything else, which actually has tremendous implications for policy, for the trajectory of America's role in the world. And missed in all of this also is that there's also a profoundly cultural thing that President Trump is doing when he talks about, threatens, and uses tariffs rhetorically and also as a policy matter. You have to understand that for a part of America that has worked industrial jobs that have been on the brink of disappearing for a generation or two now, the association with tariffs is that tariffs can sometimes, maybe too infrequently, be used by a government to step in and intervene to help save an industry and to help save jobs for a short period of time. And so for a part of America that are only experiencing tariffs as having impacts on their lives as consumers, understand that there is a part of America that are also consumers, but who have an entirely different experience with tariffs and tariff policy, who see President Trump's forceful, unapologetic invocation of tariffs as an indication that he is there to fight for them. And I think that if we miss that, then we are reinforcing this really damaging cleavage inside of our own economy and our society that probably has contributed to our being where we are in the first place.
Yes.
Hi, so my name is Pushpa, I'm an LLM from India. So, well, one, Ambassador, it's very special having you here. So we actually discussed you quite a bit back home. So I used to work with the Ministry of Commerce and I used to work on trade negotiations. So I was involved with the mutually agreed solutions in the US and
Yes.
also IPEF.
Yes.
so I was on the pillar 3, the clean economy pillar. And a big part of that, as well as pillar 2, was on labor commitments. So just transition, but more interestingly in pillar 2 was the IPEF labor advisory mechanism, which I think was a softer version of the rapid enforcement mechanism. So I wanted to see now that, and it's really interesting the point you made about news not really focusing on some of the labor enforcement mechanisms of trade agreements. I hear very little about the IPEF labor advisory mechanism. Is that working? Do you think that the Trump administration will try to enforce it in the same way that they've been trying to utilize the rapid enforcement mechanism in the USMCA?
That's a great question. I mean, pillars 2, 3, and 4 were negotiated by the Commerce Department. We had our hands full with pillar 1, and India was constantly trying to figure out, are we in, are we out, we want to be dialed in, we're going to choose when they come in, right? And that was always a very interesting dance. I have to admit, I'm not very deep on the details of what is in Pillar 2, the supply chain agreement that has this labor piece of it. I'm glad that there is a labor piece of it. I think that, if it's kind of a pale shadow of what the USMCA rapid response mechanism and a glass half full is, it's there at all. Glass half empty is that it's a pale shadow of what we have in other places. But, we kind of look for your political windows of opportunity. I think probably overall better that there is something there, I think, although there may be an argument that having something there will, somehow prejudice the opportunity to make that thing stronger over time. I'm gonna confess I'm not deep on that pillar or that mechanism. I'm also not deep on the question of how the Trump administration is treating the IPEF agreements and commitments. I think that they were not super binding. I think that they were important in terms of the capacity building and the partnership building between the 14 IPEF economies. But it's an interesting question that I hadn't really focused on before, which is what's been made of IPEF during this administration. We'll say overall, I think that what continues to interest me is the U.S.-India relationship in this second Trump administration. I had thought that there was a lot of excitement and openness at the beginning, and I thought, oh great, these negotiations, this partnership was really hard to build over time, but we were really proud of it at the end of the Biden administration. We were proud of that solution of bearing the hatchet on those WTO agreements and really trying to mature the relationship beyond tit for tat. And it's been interesting to see that contrary to my fear that the Trump administration would swoop in and make an agreement very quickly, that they are finding it very difficult as well. And I think that there are good reasons for it. But what happens with that relationship is really important.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm curious if you think if there's anything you wish unions understood, like UAW saying how much they hate NAFTA, if you think there's any conversation in the labor movement space that you think oversimplifies trade or gets trade wrong.
Yeah, that's a great question.
And then my other question was, do you feel like improving American workers' lives and conditions really depends on just uplifting labor conditions outside the country? Are they inextricably linked?
Great questions. One, is there anything that I wish that the labor unions like UAW understood about how trade agreements work? I'm going to flip that around. There's a lot that I wish that trade negotiators and other economic policymakers understood about how workers have experienced our trade policies. We just haven't heard them. And then, still when I talk to some really smart economists here, they'll say, well, our manufacturing base has been, a certain percentage before, it's still a certain percentage, there have been lots of jobs, but we're still producing at the same rate. So, does it really matter? And my breath is a little bit taken away because that matters. It's people's lives and their futures and their livelihoods, and the sense of disrespect and abandonment that a significant part of our workforce has experienced, and the rest of us haven't wanted to hear it, right? Because it's been inconvenient, and it's kind of gets in the way of this inexorable force of globalization and the, you know, creation of a larger pie and the peace and the prosperity that was supposed to come from all of these trade liberalizing, free trade policies. And so, you know, I think that even today, even with someone in the White House who claims to be speaking for the working class, I still think that workers themselves are not being heard. You know, I think that the UAW, for instance, they have an enormous fight on their hands. They are fighting for their survival and their relevance to the economy that's coming. And it was really interesting, the summer of 2023 when the UAW went on strike, right? Really interesting tactics and strategy by their new president, Sharon Tai. Really kind of, I think, like surprising the producers, right? There were colleagues of mine, very senior colleagues of mine in the Biden administration, who thought that the negotiations were about, you know, the number. It was about the percentage of raise that they wanted. It was about, you know, the kinds of benefits that they wanted, right? And you know, to President Fain's credit, he came in with some like jaw-dropping numbers. But he's a negotiator. He's going to come in with big numbers so that he's not kneecapping himself in the negotiations, coming in with a modest proposal, right? But remember that was the summer also when the auto workers were on strike and when the Hollywood workers or the writers, the actors were also on strike. One thing that both sets of labor actions had in common was that they were ultimately, from my point of view, about what are workers, what is fighting for a space for workers in a time of deep and disruptive technological change. Because the writers and the actors, right, beyond the terms of the immediate contracts they were negotiating, the question was, how are we not going to be replaced by AI? How are we going to retain rights to our image? How are we going to retain power to be creative as human beings, right? And on the auto side, the real fight was about whether or not the auto workers were going to get a toehold in the EV battery factories. Because if that's the direction of evolution of this entire industry, if they're shut out of that, there's going to be no more UAW in a couple years. And it was shocking to me the degree to which even very plugged-in economic policymakers inside of the most, the administration of the most pro-union, pro-labor president in our modern times weren't getting that. And so I think I just flip that on the head and say more of us need to actually be understanding what the unions are telling us, because the union workers are inside of these facilities and they actually have insights into the industry, where it's going, and all of the economic dynamics way better than the eggheads in Washington, of which I was one. Your second question was, you know, is raising labor standards around the world like the key to protecting the interests of workers here at home? And I would say, I think it is necessary. It is a necessary part, but insufficient. Right? I thought that one of the great privileges of working in the Biden administration was that you not only had the trade representative, you know, focusing on how do our trade policies support workers better, and how do we revolutionize and innovate the way we do trade policy, but that I was working alongside people who were trying to do the same thing domestically. So the NLRB General Counsel Jennifer Abruzzo, right? NLRB GC, who actually believes in organizing and the freedom of association, fundamentally making rulings and producing outcomes that were pro-organization, pro-union. Julie Su at the Labor Department, right? Pushing the envelope on protecting workers and taking advantage of this. And all of us working across the board, and then people at the State Department, my friend Kelly Fay Rodriguez, right? Special representative for labor and workers, right? Just making sure that global labor policy came out of the Biden administration that instructed all agencies to inject worker issues into their international work. I think that's the kind of whole of government, like the whole team pushing in the same direction approach that you need to really make a difference. And I wish that there were more administrations like that. And I would say of this administration, I wish that this administration, for all of the talk about the working class and their economic policies, I wish that they would show more of that in their work.
Just go across, yeah.
Hi, you had mentioned section 307, the forced labor prevention section. I was curious, there's two other mechanisms. Section 301 of the Trade Act, which was used by USTR the first time this year against Nicaragua's unfair forced labor practices, and then this is a theory, it hasn't been tested yet, but using section 337 of the Tariff Act, the theory being that forced labor, child labor drives down prices, and that's contributes to unfair competition. Do you see these two mechanisms, like 301 being increasingly used or 337 potentially being used as viable ways, in addition to 307, to combat forced labor practices abroad?
That's interesting. Section 301 on Nicaragua does have that labor complaint piece of it. We launched that. The Trump administration, we handed it off to the Trump administration. I know that they just came out with something. I haven't had the time to look into it yet, but that was meant to be maybe an offer in the handoff. This is our theory of the case and how you could use 301 to be really pro-worker. Trump administration, do you have the courage? Do you have the stomach to take us up on it, right? So I think that's a great question, and let's see. The unions filed Section 301s against China on labor theories during the Bush administration. I think that there were two of them, and they were both turned down. And I think that now, 20, 25 years later, the fact that, the needle has moved and that there is a 301, I think Nicaragua actually was a self-initiated one by the US government, right? Shows you how I think that the worker and the labor role in trade has fundamentally shifted. That Overton window has really moved. So let's continue to track that Overton window and how it opens and how it shifts. On 337, I haven't thought deeply about this one, but if there is a theory there, I think it's worth testing. I mean, a lot of this, I feel like there's this huge need for us to innovate in our policies, and for me, it's innovating in our trade policies. And part of that innovation is taking tools that we have had and figuring out how we use them differently to get different outcomes, to get better outcomes, right? So that's sort of like 301, 307, 337, right? These are existing tools that have been around for a long time. How can we use them differently? And then I think that there's another set of tools, which is like tools that maybe we hadn't thought about before, tools that have suddenly kind of come to the forefront of our minds, like these taking of shares, this government intervention in a different way. I'm not endorsing what the Trump administration has done because I just honestly haven't done enough reading on it. I don't fully appreciate what they've done. But if that is now a tool that could also be deployed in thinking about the relationship between our trade policies and the empowerment of workers and supply chain resilience, then I welcome the introduction of those new tools. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm John Trumpor from the CLJE, and I wanted to ask you about Harvard Kennedy School professor Robert Lawrence, who has the unenviable task of completing the teaching of Lawrence Summers' class, The Political Economy of Globalization. Last year he published a book, and he very specifically attacks you in the book. And I'd like to just hear from you whether you think this is a fair critique or not. He says that he doesn't concur with your claim that the Biden trade policies are, quote, worker-centric. And three bases, very quickly. He says, U.S. blocked the appointment of appellate judges to the WTO. He said the Indo-Pacific economic framework, there was no effort to put market access negotiations, which would have helped create jobs for American workers. And then finally, he faults the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program because he says It only applies to workers affected by trade, and workers are affected by a lot of other things that he feels this should have been extended to. So that's his three-pronged critique.
No, thank you. Okay, so I've actually been on the stage with Professor Lawrence twice now in the last 2 weeks. And I didn't realize that he had written this book and that those attacks were inside the book. That now explains a lot about why he takes those opportunities to publicly attack me when I think that we're just gonna have a conversation about trade policy. So this happened as early as yesterday, right? Here's the thing, Professor Lawrence and I have made an appointment to have coffee this afternoon. Okay, because I think it's important to talk to people about ideas, and especially when you disagree. You know, I'm gonna leave what I want to raise with him in that coffee to just having the coffee and that private conversation. But obviously, he's made these claims very publicly with me present and also without me present in the book. Now I know it all makes sense. A couple thoughts, I guess, with the appellate body. His facts are just wrong. I think what he said to me yesterday was, you, Biden administration, made no attempt to reform or to resurrect the appellate body, right? Or the dispute settlement system. It's true. Our goal was not to resurrect the appellate body, because our goal across the board was not to move trade policy for America and the world back to the status quo ante. Because the status quo ante hasn't been working for us for a long time, right? At the WTO, I gave 2 speeches that apparently no one heard about how important the WTO is, despite all of its challenges and flaws, and how important it is for the WTO to have a dispute settlement system, but how important it is for that dispute settlement system to actually help to settle disputes, as opposed to just being a litigation forum through which a lot of lawyers have made a lot of money, and a lot of relationships between trading partners have just gotten worse over time. So I did offer up a reform proposal at the WTO, and we had a very robust negotiation going on that actually was informed by the Harvard Program on Negotiation interest-based negotiators principles. No one knows about it, and I'm surprised that Professor Lawrence didn't know of it, because it's his job to follow this stuff, right? Like, even if I'm not breaking through the Twitter sphere, we were still putting stuff out on Twitter. We were still putting out press statements. So first of all, like, his facts are wrong. On the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and how we basically betrayed the interests of workers by not negotiating market access and tariff liberalization. That just tells me that Professor Lawrence has never met a worker and has never had a conversation with a worker. Because I will tell you how deeply hurt and angry America's workers are about this entire agenda of tariff liberalization. Point 2. Point 3 on TAA, he keeps laying the lapsing of TAA and its design at my feet. And I think I did recommend this to him yesterday. I felt a little badly about it at the time because I thought my words were a little sharp. But now that you're really rattling me up, I'm going to double down on it. Because he also, what else did he blame me for? He also blamed me for, the design of the Inflation Reduction Act and why it's so flagrantly anti-WTO. And I just thought, I think that what we need is maybe like a civics refresher on how a bill becomes a law. And it's actually not the US Trade Representative that makes laws. They are members of Congress that have to negotiate amongst themselves, and it is an important branch of government and part of our democracy. And then it's the US Trade Representative's job to deal with all of the fallout with our trading partners at the WTO, et cetera. So thank you for that. You succeeded in getting me to respond, but now I have even more things to talk about.
If you want, we can have you review his book. Respected academic journal.
All right, I think that is a perfect note to end on. I will say the idea that you have any responsibility for TAA, even when it's in place, it's Department of Labor responsibility.
Yes, it is.
And it's a program with many flaws. So yeah, that one. The others I leave to your expertise. I will lend you my expertise to say that that's ridiculous. Okay, please join me in thanking